economics of, oh, thank you so much, Mel. I appreciate it. To talk about the economics of preservation. Just to start, we, and can you all see my screen? Yep, okay, cool. We are going to be using the website Menti or Mentimeter. And so I want to give you guys a second just to get to this website and enter this code, because we have a couple questions for you in the coming slides, and this code will be key so that you can kind of see the questions and enter your answer. So I'll just give you a second to go ahead and do that. All right. I'm seeing lots of thumbs up, so I think that means folks have gotten where they needed to go. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. But if anybody has questions, just raise your hands and I can see. Hold on just a second. Yeah. Or I. Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. Sorry, we had some technical difficulties here in the office. We're back on track. Okay, so our agenda for today, we'll do a brief introduction and the icebreaker, like I said. Then we'll introduce our consultants and we'll explain what historic preservation is and what our historic preservation plan is intended to do. Then Donovan will present, and after we'll have a question and answer. Finally, we'll give you next steps on how you can stay engaged throughout this historic preservation plan process. So first, we want to start in one word, what is most special to you about Crested Butte's past? So I'll give a second, and I think it should populate the answers on the screen as folks start to answer. Seeing a lot of good words. Real people, real community, rough edges, sustainability. Very good. Architecture, history, right in the middle there. I appreciate that. All right, so I'll move on to the next question. So in one word, if you can answer, what is the most special to you now about Crested Butte in the present? And it might be the same thing, or it might be something completely different. Funkiness, unique people, community. Field of flowers. I love it. So Moving forward, our consultants who are with us today for this project are Stan Clausen Associates, Inc. and Tatanka Historical Associates, Ron Sladek. So they're with us, and if they'd like to say a hello or anything like that, I'll welcome to say hello.
Hi, everyone. I'm excited about this project. I think it's going to be really interesting to see it fit together with the other components of the Compass Plan. And we look forward to working with everyone. We had a wonderful meeting with City Council in Beaux-Arts last night, and I can say that they're very engaged by what we are going to be doing. So look forward to Donovan's talk and look forward to working with you all at Crested Butte.
I'll say a quick word. Ron Slodek here with Tatanka Historical Associates. I was in Crested Butte, was it last week? For, I guess, early last week for 3 days, spent some time with Jesse and Mel, and got to do an in-depth look at the town and its historic resources. I was pretty impressed with how many historic buildings and other resources are still standing there and that really give Crested Butte a unique character within a beautiful environment that it's located. So I'm looking forward to continued work on the project and to meeting many more of the citizens and stakeholders in the coming months.
Thanks, Stan and Ron. So this project was awarded a mini grant by the Colorado State Historical Fund. And during this process, we might revisit, for instance, a discussion on a new period of significance, identify new preservation strategies to employ, and provide recommendations on updates to the town's design standards and guidelines, which might take place in 2025, based upon some other planning processes we'll have going on in 2024 as well. This plan will use a combination of visual surveys and analysis of the town's existing building stock and architecture after 1952, combined with community engagement events like today and our event tonight at Kachivers to identify alternative preservation strategies moving forward. So you might ask, what is the historic preservation plan? And Donovan's going to help with that too, just overall with historic preservation. But historic preservation, a quick definition is, historic preservation is the practice of protecting and preserving sites, structures, or districts which reflect elements of local or national history. And that's a very quick definition. But this plan basically will help to guide the town's preservation strategy moving forward and aims to look at ways to protect Crested Butte's historic buildings that reflect the different periods of the town's history, while potentially allowing more architectural creativity for new construction in appropriate areas. And that's just a potential idea moving forward. This is just a brief history of Crested Butte. Many of you are familiar with this, but our period of significance is 1880 to 1952, which represents the coal mining era. And then it moves into skiing, tourism, and the National Historic District, Beaux-Arts being established in the 1970s, and then on forward to today. So this is how our planning process will work. It's a 4-phase process. We're in phase 1, which, as I mentioned before, consists of our data collection and our plan preparation. Throughout this process, we would love to speak to any members who are on today of the community, just to get your feedback or questions about the process. So we just want to keep that door open to everyone. And then without further ado, I'd like to introduce Donovan Rypkema, who's with us today. Donovan is the principal of Place Economics and president of Heritage Strategies International. Both firms work at the nexus of economics and historic preservation. He's worked in 49 states and more than 50 countries. He is the author of numerous articles and publications, as well as the book, The Economics of Historic Preservation, a Community Leader's Guide, which has been translated into Russian, Georgian, and Korean. He's also a lecturer in the University of Pennsylvania's graduate program in historic preservation, where he received the G. Holmes Perkins Award for Distinguished Teaching. Donovan also received the Louise DuPont Crowninshield Award from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the nation's highest preservation honor given for lifetime contributions to historic preservation. He serves on the Board of Global Urban Development, the Advisory Board of Ian, the Advisory Board of Small Business Anti-Displacement Network, and the Real Estate Market Advisory Board of the UN Economic Commission for Europe. And with that, I'll turn the screen back over to Donovan, and you can share your screen now.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. Am I sharing?
I don't see it yet.
Okay, let me try again. Hold on. You're supposed to be smarter than the technology to do this right, so. How about now?
Yes, you're on.
Okay. Thank you all for being here. I have mixed feelings. I'd much rather be there in person, but having grown up in Western South Dakota, I know the hazards of risks of travel in December to places like Colorado. So probably safer to be where I am. I've been in lots of Colorado towns, but never Crested Butte. So when I saw your responses to what you value about both its past and its current, it's definitely a place that I'd like to visit. So anyway, thanks all for being here. What you're going to hear today is lots of kind of geeky data stuff. Our firm, 2/3 of our work domestically is doing analyses of impacts of historic preservation. And in recent years, a lot of that has been at the city level, including big places, New York and Los Angeles and San Antonio and Phoenix, and some mid-sized places like Indianapolis and Miami-Dade County and Nashville and Raleigh, and then small places like Saratoga Springs, New York, and Frankfort, Kentucky, Cumberland, Maryland. And so really most of what you're going to hear from me is little factoids that we've gotten from what we've learned in those places. But I want to start out kind of geeking you out on the kind of research side, is to make the distinction between stated preference and revealed preference, both of which we use in our analyses. And here's my kind of simplified analysis of that. So we could, stated preference is, we could ask a question. We could do the kind of survey you just did and say, how many of you prefer vanilla ice cream? And a bunch of you would raise your hands. And so how many prefer chocolate? And others would raise their hands. That's stated preference. I'm saying I like chocolate ice cream better. Or we could, in fact, wheel in a cart with ice cream cones. And you just go up and order your ice cream cone, and some of you are going to order vanilla and some of you chocolate. Well, you don't have to say, I like chocolate better. You revealed your preference for chocolate simply by taking a chocolate ice cream cone. And so when you hear these factoids from these studies, some of them are going to be stated preference, and some of them are going to be revealed preference, but of the marketplace, showing their attraction to and preference for historic preservation, historic buildings, historic neighborhoods, and so forth. Lots of, when I was asked to do this, when Jessica asked me to do this session, I kind of debated in my head how to approach it. And oftentimes, what happens with historic preservation is there's a bunch of conventional wisdom about preservation that just ain't so. And so a lot of the work that we do and what our studies often do is really myth breakers about what people think is true about historic preservation, in fact, is not true. And so I've really structured this around a handful of myths about preservation, followed by what, in fact, we've discovered in these studies. And one of those is that commercial historic districts are too expensive for small businesses and startup businesses. Now, not every place from which I'm going to show you data is comparable to Crested Butte. I understand that. But most all of these findings are pretty consistent through the region of the country, through the size of the city, through the character of the historic resources. So In fact, is it too expensive for small businesses? Well, here is a relatively small place, maybe the size of Crested Butte, Saratoga Springs, New York, where we looked at historic resources there. And the historic districts in Saratoga Springs, New York, include about 22% of all the jobs in the city, but 31% of the small firm jobs and 46% of the young firm jobs. Again, this is the marketplace revealing its preference to be in historic districts. Here's San Antonio. And the purple areas you see are local historic districts in San Antonio. The green circles are concentration of jobs that are in businesses with employing fewer than 20 people. And what you're seeing here is not that everybody is in the historic districts, but this is clustering effect to be in or near these historic districts that represent the character, one of the best words that you used to describe Crested Butte, the character places that those businesses choose to locate in. Here's Los Angeles at the other end of the scale. In Los Angeles, what most of the rest of us call historic districts in Los Angeles, they call HPOZs, Historic Preservation Overlay Zones. And in LA, there's lots of residential commercial historic districts. There's not very many commercial historic districts, but we looked at those that are. And we looked at all of the jobs that the commercial historic districts in LA are a little less than 2% of all jobs, but they're over 4% of the startup jobs, new firms starting up, choosing to be in those historic districts. Here's Nashville, a city that maybe is prospering too much, lots of at risk there. And again, in Nashville, 3% of all of the jobs are in historic districts, but 11% of the job growth, 13% of the startup jobs, 15% of small business jobs have chosen to be in those historic districts. This is Miami-Dade County. And again, it's about a little less than 5% of all the jobs in Dade County, but 5.2% of the job growth, but of the startup jobs, people just starting up. Again, about 6.2% of all the jobs are there, but 25% of the growth in startup jobs took place in those commercial historic districts in Miami-Dade County. Another myth, that 21st century cutting edge businesses and the creative class, they want 21st century cutting edge buildings. Well, here is Rhode Island. And we looked at, there was a statewide study, and we looked particularly at where the business that would fall in the creative class and the knowledge worker kinds of businesses. Again, in the state of Rhode Island, a little less than 4% of all the jobs are in historic districts, but in the areas of professional, scientific, and technical services, educational services, other public services, management of companies and enterprises, and importantly, this core of the creative class, arts, entertainment, and recreation, all have a disproportionate share where those businesses have chosen to be in historic districts. And then New York City. You can love New York, you can hate New York, but nobody can say that it's not one of the most creative cities in the world. And in Manhattan, about 12.5% of all jobs in Manhattan are in historic districts, but 16% of information jobs, 21% of educational services, and importantly, almost 24% of arts, entertainment, and recreation jobs are in those historic districts. So a disproportionate share of businesses preferring to be in the historic districts. In fact, and so you can say, well, yeah, but the big guys, they don't care about that. Well, in the city of New York, what are called the FANG industries, some of them have changed their name since the FANG days, but Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google, that every one of those have either bought and restored historic buildings, or they have signed long-term leases in historic buildings, reflecting, frankly, the preference of their employees. The only thing those cutting-edge businesses have going for them is their employees, and they're mostly young and particular about where they work. And there's just this recognition that our young employees don't want to be in some stupid glass tower. They want to be in buildings with character, and that is historic buildings. And then the character, and again, I love that character was one of the descriptors of Crested Butte, this myth that the character of commercial districts is a minor concern to shoppers. Well, I want to give you some kind of polar opposite examples. We did a study in the city of Palm Beach, Florida. Weird place, one of the weirdest places in America, and less than 10,000 people live there, but they have two different streets they call not Millionaires Row, that they call Billionaires Row in Palm Beach, a place of great wealth. And their main street, a wonderful street, it's called Worth Avenue. And so we did a survey of the population when we were doing the study in Palm Beach. And one of the questions was, we gave them lots of choices and say, is this characteristic very important, somewhat important, not important, whatever. And one of them was, how important do you think the following are as Worth Avenue assets? And the historic character was one of the choices. Well, 80% said it was very important, and another 16% said it was important. So you have over 90% of the population of Palm Beach saying that the historic character of their main street is important. I don't think you could get 90% of the population of Palm Beach to agree that the sun rises in the east. And yet that was the share that attributed the importance of historic resources in their main street. And then of the assets of Worth Avenue. So at the top of the list is walkability, and then the quality of merchandise, and then the historic character. So way up the list of what's important. Then we did a study in Calgary, Alberta, and they had us looking at 4 commercial neighborhoods that had a concentration of heritage buildings. And so as part of that study, we again did a survey, a general population survey, and asked about those commercial districts, what's important? Well, the thing most important is walkable, no surprise there. And next most important thing was the historic character of the area. It's not how cheap the prices are, it's the historic character that's important in those districts. And then one that's been a kind of myth for a long time, and that is historic districts require another layer of regulation, and therefore that hurts property values. Again, I've been doing this kind of analysis of impacts of preservation for a long time now, and this has been one that just continues to pop up. Oh, well, you're going to have regulations. You're going to tell me what I can do or can't do with my house, and so therefore it's going to hurt the property values. Well, this is the area that's been studied by more people in more parts of the country with different methodologies than any other, with really consistent findings. And Savannah is a good example. So we looked at in this 15-year period in Savannah in the change of property values in these areas. So we compared, they have 4 local historic districts, and we compared the change in value of properties in those districts to the city as a whole. Well, property values over this 15-year period, they went up every place, but every single historic district went up more than the city as a whole. Again, some of these are very wealthy neighborhoods. The Victorian is a really wealthy neighborhood. Some of them are the opposite of wealthy neighborhoods. Didn't matter. They outperformed the city as a whole. Now, the years involved are not a coincidence either, in that this 15-year period, you remember at the end of the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s, that real estate was going up in value at kind of ludicrous rates, and then a big international crash, and then a recovery. And this time period covers all 15 of those, or all 3 of those cycles, historic preservation outperforming the rest of the market. Here is again, this one is Indianapolis. Excuse me, I can only see part of my screen here. The Indianapolis change over time with the same pattern of outperforming the market as a whole. And again, what's interesting is here again is an example of markets going up, markets falling, and markets recovering. So in the up years, the historic districts do better. In the bad years, it's not that they never lose value, but they lose less, and the recovery is stronger. So what's indicative of this is that even in weak markets, there's this latent demand for properties in historic districts that kind of mitigates the loss in value in down markets. But it's not true of all of those studies came from residential areas, but it's true of commercial areas as well. So here again is Nashville. We looked at this 12-year period. We looked at properties in the historic districts in downtown Nashville, compared their change in value to the rest of downtown. Again, almost double the enhancement of value in those historic districts. Here's in Calgary. Again, what we looked at in Calgary is what we referred to as the heritage premium, that there's a fundamental value to this heritage buildings, but there was a premium of about 11% because they were heritage buildings. And again, this isn't some bureaucrat waving a wand and saying, well, you're an historic building. This is the market responding to the value, underlying value of those heritage buildings. Then in New York City, we'd actually done 2 studies in New York City, and the Real Estate Board of New York is the professional real estate guys thing. And I'm not anti-real estate. That's the world from which I come. But they have periodic attacks on the historic preservation system in New York City. And the most recent one was, it was during the pandemic, saying, these historic districts, the vacancy is high. It's killing us. That regulation of those historic districts, killing the real estate industry in those areas. So what we did, there's a company, a data company called CoStar, that's the most comprehensive real estate data company in the country. We had to buy their expensive data, and they have neighborhoods. They've identified neighborhoods throughout New York, and so we identified those in their neighborhoods as high density preservation, and that was places where over 20% of the properties were under the purview of the Landmark Commission, moderate density preservation, and low density preservation, and those were the categories. And then we sorted what the differences were in those categories of neighborhoods. So we first looked at this issue about vacancy. In fact, this was for offices. In fact, the high density preservation areas had the lowest density or lowest vacancy of all the neighborhoods. And then we looked at the rents, and the highest rents were in fact in the medium intensity preservation areas, and the price, the value of the office buildings highest in those preservation areas. So this absurdity that somehow the real estate industry is suffering from the preservation review is just sheer, utter, complete nonsense. We looked then at retail. And here's one, you say, maybe those guys are right in that the highest vacancy, retail vacancy rate in that high intensity preservation, not actually too high, 4.8%, but it's higher than the rest. Except look at this. Yeah, the reason it's higher than the rest is that the rents in those high density areas, in fact, are almost twice the next highest, and about almost 4 times as much as in the New York metro area, in both rents and in the sales price of those properties. So the idea that somehow they're suffering because they have to apply for design guidelines is just nonsense. And then we have, and frankly, I know Colorado is a great state for environmentalists, God bless them all, but one of the big myths that environmentalists have posited for decades is those old buildings, they're just energy hogs, and the wind blows through them. We got to get rid of those old buildings and replace them with green gizmos. So in LA, we looked at what it means when we tear down a really modest size building, 2,000 square foot house in Los Angeles. Well, what that does, it generates almost 300 cubic yards of crap that goes into the landfill, 84 tons of it. That's certainly not an environmentally responsible activity. And then Bloomberg, when he was mayor of the city of New York, wanted to put the city on a path to be the most environmentally responsible city in the world. And good businessman that he is, he said, well, step one, we have to figure out where we're using energy now. So he commissioned this massive energy audit, both residential and office buildings, to say where are we using the energy now. This study had nothing to do with historic buildings. It just said where are we using the energy, contrary to what environmentalists and lots of architects have told us. Well, it's those new buildings, we have these energy efficient new buildings. Now, wasn't true at all. In fact, the least energy consumption per square foot were the oldest buildings. Every decade that went forward, in fact, there was more use of energy per square foot. And then this issue about, historic preservation is kind of nice, but we're in the economic development business, and we need to be about job creation. And historic preservation isn't that. Well, here's a kind of rule of thumb. In the United States, when you build a new building, it's going to be about half labor and half materials. When you rehabilitate an historic building, then it becomes 60 to 70% labor, and the balance is materials. And that's what's called labor intensity. And it makes a huge difference, not just in the original project, but in terms of the follow-on benefits, that local expenditure, because labor spends its money locally, materials don't spend any money. So you install the sink doesn't have any other economic effect, but the plumber who installed the sink does. He or she spends their money locally, buys groceries, joins the YMCA, and that's this local impact of labor intensity. We did a study in the state of Arkansas, where we looked at their state tax credit program, 25 million in 24 cities, spurred $224 million of investment. But what that meant was jobs. 775 direct jobs, 133 indirect jobs. Every time $1 million was spent rehabilitating a historic building in Arkansas, that's what it meant. 7 million in direct income, 4.7 million in indirect and induced income. So it makes this, every time $1 million is spent in rehabilitating an historic building in Arkansas, there's an additional $708,000 of economic activity generated within the state. But it's not just in the construction side. Again, in Los Angeles, again, a vibrant economy, and not all that many local historic districts, but a number of commercial historic districts. In terms of job growth over that 10-year period, both the local and the national register districts outperform this vibrant economy in the rest of Los Angeles. Again, in Nashville, the rate of job growth in commercial historic districts, 40%, as compared to 9% growth in the rest of the city. Here's Cumberland, Maryland. Now, this is not a place that has a vibrant local economy. In fact, over the 15-year period we looked at, the city itself lost jobs, but not in the historic districts. There was a gain of jobs in those historic districts. Again, revealing the preference of the marketplace to locate their businesses, to employ those people in historic areas. And then a common one. Well, those still put historic districts, they just freeze neighborhoods in amber, and you can't ever change after that. And we need cities that change and evolve. We just can't have places that are frozen forever. Well, we looked in Savannah, and of course, Savannah, one of the great historic cities in America, and very robust protections of historic resources. But we looked at construction expenditures in Savannah's historic districts. In fact, there was more in new construction than there was in rehabilitation in those historic districts in Savannah. Certainly not a case of then having that neighborhood frozen where no change can take place. Lots of change taking place. Here is again in Miami, where the population growth, growing place in population, but the growth in the historic districts was greater than the growth in the county as a whole. Again, you can't have population growth if you don't have new construction, adaptive reuse, expansion of some kind, and that was happening in their local historic districts. And then a common one, and I don't know what kind of issue, issues of diversity and others are in Crested Butte, but a common issue is, yeah, those historic neighborhoods, they're nice, but they're for rich white people and not for the rest of us. Well, so we've looked at this almost every place we've done a story, and this is Indianapolis. The horizontal line is the share of the white population in the city of Indianapolis, about 60% of the whole population. And then all of the vertical lines are local historic districts. And what you're seeing here is that, yeah, some historic districts are a little more white in makeup. Some of them are a little more black in makeup. But by and large, in the aggregate, the historic districts are a reflection of the racial makeup of the city as a whole. Here's the state of Rhode Island. And here we looked by household income level. And when I first saw the numbers, I thought maybe my colleagues were trying to play a joke on me because they're such almost an exact statistical mirror of the population as a whole. And that is, who lives in historic districts in Rhode Island is a mirror of economically who lives in Rhode Island as a whole. Again, you don't have to share this opinion. It's kind of our firm's perspective, but we think healthy neighborhoods are a mirror of the demographic economic makeup of a city as a whole, and that's what historic neighborhoods tend to be. And then Rhode Island is a state that's mostly white, not big minority population, but once again, when you sort it by race, same answer. Virtual mirror in the historic districts about who lives in the state as a whole. Here is San Antonio. Not a large Black population in San Antonio, but it's a majority Latino population. And who lives in historic districts by ethnicity, virtually the same as lives in the city as a whole. And then maybe my favorite finding in this regard is in Buffalo, New York. That is very candidly a segregated city. So we looked at the lowest census unit, census block level, and we broke up those census blocks into three categories. What we called essentially segregated neighborhoods that were 80% or more, either all white or all Black. Mixed race neighborhoods that were 60 to 80% either Black or white, or what we called fully integrated neighborhoods that were no more than 40 to 60% of one race. And what we found here is the Black population is that the share of the population living in essentially segregated neighborhoods, almost 70% of the Black population in the rest of Buffalo, just over half in the historic districts. In the fully integrated neighborhoods, less than 9% in the rest of Buffalo, twice as much in the historic the neighborhoods. And the white population, same patterns, is that 36% of the white population lives in essentially all white neighborhoods, but only 22% in historic districts. And the other end, 22%, 23% of the white population in historic districts lives in these mixed race, truly mixed race neighborhoods. In fact, in Buffalo, the only place statistically you're apt to see a white person and a Black person, in fact, living as next door neighbors, is in the local historic districts. And then Los Angeles, one of the most diverse cities in the country. And we looked at other, and other tends to be Native American, South Pacific Islanders, kind of mixed things. But we look at ethnically other, Asian and Black, all had a greater representation in historic districts than in the city as a whole. The only group that was somewhat underrepresented in historic districts was in fact the white population. And then this issue about historic districts are the cause of the affordable housing crisis and gentrification. And affordable housing, of course, is a challenge in almost every place, large and small, every place in America today. And in Boulder, and you all know Boulder well, and I brought up this data since you'd know it, and it's another place, no question, there's a housing affordability crisis. But the idea that somehow historic districts are responsible for that, again, is nonsense. About 1.5% of the land area of Boulder's in historic districts. 98% isn't. You can't be saying that the fault of that 1.5% of the land that's responsible for the housing cost crisis. And if you even narrow it down to just residentially zoned area, 3% of the residentially zoned area in Boulder is in historic districts, 97% isn't. So it's not that there's not a housing crisis, it's just that it's silly to say, well, that's the fault of the historic districts. Then for those of you who are involved in housing, there's this concept called housing cost burden. And that is when more than 30% of a household's income is spent on housing. Well, Miami-Dade County is certainly a place where there's a high level of housing cost burden. Too large a share of the population, both among homeowners and renters, in fact, are suffering from housing cost burden. But whatever that is, it is less true in historic districts than it is in the rest of the city. In Cumberland, Maryland, again, kind of at the other end of the economic spectrum, in fact, where the affordable housing is, meeting the needs of people at the 80% of area median income and less, disproportionately is in those local historic districts. Not only isn't the cause of the affordable housing crisis, in fact, it's a major part of the response to that crisis. Here in Portland, Maine, where they had good records about rental data, because people have to register their rental units and report where they are. Contrary to what the city staff thought was true, all those historic districts, nobody can afford to live there but rich people. In fact, it was in the historic districts where the lower rents were. A larger share of the lower rents were in those historic districts, not in the rest of the city. But then people in the last decade, people who are kind of housing economists saying, well, yeah, rent or mortgage payment's important, but that's not the only part of the equation. Transportation is the other part. And it's fine to live in a cheap place to live, but if you have to spend, $40 a day to get to your job, it wipes out the affordability issue. So it's this other metric, this H plus T, housing plus transportation. And again, and looking at LA, too many people are over the line in the affordability on the housing plus transportation metric, but it's greater problem, in fact, in the rest of the city than it is in the historic districts. And then the kind of connection, all of that is, well, those historic districts, they're causing the affordable housing problem, and that, in fact, means gentrification. This is not to say that gentrification doesn't exist. It exists. But this idea that somehow it's the historic districts that are cause of that, once again, is a nonsense argument. In LA, when we did the study there, our client, which was the Los Angeles Conservancy, said, look, you got to look at gentrification here. That if we release a report that doesn't address gentrification, everybody will dismiss the entire finding. So whatever the answers are, you got to look at gentrification. So we did. And fortunately for us, there were people way smarter than we are at UCLA and USC that had done a long-term gentrification study in Los Angeles. And they looked from the period of 2000 to 2015. And the orange areas on the map are where they identified that gentrification had taken place in LA. We took their map and we overlaid it with the local historic districts. And those are the hatched areas. And what you can see is there's almost no overlap. That maybe 15% of the historic districts are in a gentrifying area and maybe 10% of the gentrifying areas are in a historic district. But largely there's just no relationship. So it doesn't mean that gentrification doesn't take place, hasn't taken place, but the idea that somehow that's the fault of the historic district, just factually incorrect. And then an issue that, well, historic buildings, they're okay, but they're just old buildings. They have whatever value they have as a piece of real estate and no more. Well, the city of St. Augustine, Florida, that claims the mantle of being the oldest European settlement in the Western Hemisphere, is very concerned about climate change and sea level rise. And so they're doing a climate change mitigation study. And so we were part of a team there to look at a couple things. And one of those was to look at the change in value over time of their historic buildings and what share of those were in the floodplains, which we did. And again, the action was like the change in value was like you saw earlier. The historic districts did better than the city as a whole. But the point is that the value of the historic districts in St. Augustine just shade over $1 billion. So that's the value of the historic real estate in St. Augustine as pieces of real estate. But they have a huge tourism industry in St. Augustine, and they have a great research arm looking at their visitors. And so we sorted all of that data, and we identified who were, of all of their visitors, who were heritage visitors, who were coming to town for the heritage resources. And we had two categories. Those we called our core heritage visitors, those who stated that was their specific purpose for coming to St. Augustine. And then we had a category called opportunity heritage visitors who came for some other reason, came to go to the beach or play golf or something else, but did heritage activities while they were there. And we sorted those out. And so we knew how much they were spending, both day visitor and night visitors, where they were spending it, doing all that stuff. And then there's an approach that's called the travel cost method. That if you decided to drive to Denver for the weekend to see a football game, well, the value of that football game to you is more than the price of the football tickets. You spent 2 days worth of your time. You had gasoline driving down there. You had to pay for meals and a hotel while you were there. And so the value of that game is the sum of the expenditures you made to go to the football game in Denver. That's called the travel cost method. So we had all this data, how many heritage visitors there were, where they came from, their characteristics, how much they spent on travel, how long they stayed, how much they spent per day. And if we take the sum of those visitors, we can come up with the value of heritage to those visitors. Well, we said that the value of real estate, heritage buildings in St. Augustine as real estate was a little over $1 billion. As value to those visitors was almost $3 billion. So this huge increment that the value of those heritage buildings in St. Augustine are over and above what they happen to be for as pieces of real estate. So this is an economics lecture, and so I want to finish with a quotation from one of the great American economists, John Kenneth Galbraith. Here's what he wrote. The preservation movement has one great curiosity. There is never retrospective controversy or regret. Preservationists are the only people in the world who are invariably confirmed in their wisdom after the fact. Thanks very much, and I'm happy to take any questions, comments, alternative views, or whatever. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Donovan. I'll reshare my screen, and it'll enable you to add a comment to the screen itself, or you can also just raise your hand in Zoom, and I'm happy to allow you to talk that way too. So you can type questions in the Minty website, or you can raise your hand. Don't be shy.
You mean none of you are numbers geeks? Do you want to know methodologies or anything like that?
Okay, well, no one's asking questions. I'm going to go ahead and put up my next slide, but feel free to just raise your hand if you do have a question for Donovan. We hope that you enjoyed this today and it's got you excited and interested about participating in the process moving forward. So our next event for community engagement will be tonight at Kachevers at 6 p.m. Please join us for trivia and fun. The link on the page here we have a second link there, which is to our website, which will keep you updated on what the process is moving forward and other events and meetings moving forward. So thank you all again for your time today. And I just want to make sure no one has their hand raised. I don't see anything. Thank you very much all for your time. And thanks so much to Donovan for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. Good luck. I'm looking
Thank
forward
you.
to figuring out a way to get to Crested Butte one of these days, but in the spring, not the winter.
Thank you.